1958, the Cold War wasn't being fought on battlefields. It was being fought in hearts, headlines, and television screens. And that spring, for a brief and humiliating moment, America nearly lost. Not to a missile, not to a coup, but to a fair. The Brussels World's Fair, Expo 58, was supposed to be a celebration of peace and progress, the first great global exhibition since the devastation of World War II. But in reality, it became something else, a stage for the world's two superpowers to show who was winning the future. For the Soviet Union, it was a chance to prove that socialism had triumphed over capitalism. For the United States, it was an opportunity to showcase democracy, innovation, and the promise of the American way. What played out in Brussels was more than a public embarrassment. It was a symptom of something deeper. To understand why that fair mattered so much, you have to step back and see the world as it was in 1958, a world divided not by geography, but by belief, a world where every invention, every speech, and every public gesture became ammunition in a war that no one dared to call by name. By the late 1950s, the world had changed beyond recognition. The Second World War had ended more than a decade earlier, but its shadow still stretched across continents. Europe was rebuilding, Asia was reshaping, and two new giants stood over the ruins, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations had survived the war, but more than that, they had emerged with global ambitions, and now they were locked in a rivalry that went far beyond politics. The Cold War was a contest of systems, of stories, of whose vision for humanity would dominate the modern age. Missiles and armies were one part of it, but not the most visible. This was a war of perception, a battle for the soul of the post-war world. Each side wanted to convince the billions watching from the sidelines, in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that their model was the future. By 1958, the competition had taken on a new front, culture. If the Soviet Union could show that communism brought prosperity and progress, it might sway developing nations to its orbit. If the United States could demonstrate that freedom created innovation and happiness, it could hold the moral high ground. That's what made the Brussels World's Fair so important. It wasn't just an exhibition of architecture or technology. It was a live global broadcast of ideology. 40 nations would take part. 40 nations would build their vision of progress under one roof, and standing side by side just a few hundred meters apart would be the two greatest adversaries the world had ever seen. The Soviets had one goal: shock the world. They arrived early. Their pavilion was enormous, sleek, modern, filled with dazzling machinery. At its heart stood their crown jewel, Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, launched just months before. The sight of that polished sphere, a simple, silver ball that had already orbited the Earth, was more powerful than any speech. It was proof that the Soviet Union had beaten America into space. It was a symbol of the future, and a quiet warning that Moscow could send more than satellites across the sky. Visitors were awestruck. Journalists lined up for tours. Even Western scientists couldn't help but admire the engineering. For the first time, many Europeans whispered a dangerous thought. Maybe the Soviets were catching up. Maybe, just maybe, they were ahead and America wasn't ready. When the United States delegation reached Brussels, they expected applause. After all, America was at the height of its post-war power, wealthy, industrialized, confident. Its cities glittered with modern skylines, its car factories ran non-stop, and its technology powered the new atomic age. The American century, as some had called it, seemed unstoppable. But when workers began unpacking crates at the fairgrounds, reality hit hard. The U.S. pavilion wasn't ready. While the Soviet structure loomed sleek and triumphant, towering glass walls, red banners, proud displays of rockets and turbines, the American site was still half-finished. Delays, budget disputes, and bureaucratic bickering back home had crippled the project before it even began. Officials from the U.S. Information Agency, the State Department, and private sponsors had spent months arguing over what message the pavilion should send. Should it be about freedom, science, capitalism? No one agreed. And in trying to show everything, they ended up showing almost nothing. When the doors finally opened to the public, the contrast was painful. The Soviet exhibit was a thunderous ode to progress. metal, motion, and power. The American one looked like a department store. Inside there were Coca-Cola machines, kitchen appliances, Ford cars, and television sets showing images of smiling suburban families. The intent was to highlight American prosperity, to prove that the average U.S. citizen enjoyed a standard of living that communism couldn't match. But for many European visitors, it came across as tone-deaf. These were people who still remembered rationing, bombed-out neighborhoods, and economic struggle. To them, the Soviet pavilion spoke of rebuilding and strength. The American one spoke of comfort and consumerism, journalists noticed. Headlines across Europe began to appear. The Russians show their might, the Americans show their kitchen. A battle of ideologies fought in steel and plastic. Even friendly nations found the contrast hard to ignore. Where the Soviets projected discipline and unity, the Americans looked scattered, as if unsure what they were trying to prove. In the press rooms, Soviet representatives smiled quietly. They didn't need to mock the United States. The exhibits did it for them. And behind the scenes, U.S. officials started to panic. They had come to prove that democracy was the engine of progress. But somehow they had made it look like a commercial break. As crowds continued to pour through the gates, something became clear. The world wasn't laughing with America. It was laughing at it. To many observers, this wasn't the confident America that had rebuilt Europe or landed atomic power. This was an empire out of touch, a country that mistook consumption for culture. The Soviet Union, for once, didn't have to fire a shot or launch a rocket. They had already won this round, with display cases, lighting, and timing. And inside the American pavilion, the crowds kept moving, polite, curious, unimpressed. But across the Atlantic, inside government offices and diplomatic cables, the tone was different. The Brussels fair was meant to be a symbol of confidence. Instead, it became a warning light on the Cold War dashboard. Reports from U.S. diplomats began landing in Washington. The Soviet presentation is commanding overwhelming attention. European audiences are responding strongly to Soviet technological progress. The American exhibit appears fragmented, overly commercial. For the Eisenhower administration, it was embarrassing and dangerous. This wasn't just about public relations. It was about influence. The Cold War wasn't confined to Moscow and Washington. It was playing out in newly independent nations across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Those governments were watching closely, deciding which system to align with. If the United States looked hollow, the consequences could ripple far beyond Brussels. The issue wasn't just the fair itself. It was what it revealed. While the Soviet Union had a single, tightly controlled propaganda machine, the U.S. approach was fractured. Part government, part private enterprise, part advertising. There was no unified message, no clear story. President Eisenhower's advisors moved quickly to contain the damage. They urged the U.S. Information Agency to reframe the narrative, emphasize scientific achievement, education, and the strength of democratic cooperation. Within weeks, new exhibits were proposed and shipped over, displays about nuclear research, architecture, and medicine. American universities sent materials showing breakthroughs in physics and engineering. Cultural performances were added, symphonies, jazz musicians, and modern artists, a reminder that American creativity wasn't confined to consumer goods. But it was clear that the Soviets had already scored a decisive first impression. Sputnik, gleaming under the lights of Brussels, had done more for Soviet prestige than any diplomatic mission in years. And inside Washington, strategists began to accept an uncomfortable truth. The United States had underestimated the power of image. Military power could deter. Economic strength could rebuild. But without persuasion, without narrative, those advantages could be lost in the global conversation. The Brussels failure became a quiet but powerful case study in perception. It showed how quickly public opinion could shift, how fragile prestige could be when presentation fell short of reality. And in that realization, America's Cold War strategy began to evolve. The administration commissioned a review of how the U.S. represented itself abroad. Officials called for exhibitions that told a coherent story, one that linked freedom to progress, democracy to dignity. The message was simple but urgent. Never again should the United States look unsure of its own purpose. In the years to come, that lesson would shape a new chapter of the Cold War, one fought with ideas, art and television screens instead of guns. But in 1958 at Brussels, that transformation was still taking shape, born out of embarrassment, urgency, and a determination not to repeat the mistake. Within the U.S. government, it became known as the fair that changed everything, not because it ended in disaster, but because it forced America to rethink how it told its story to the world. In the aftermath, the State Department and the U.S. Information Agency held a series of urgent meetings. Memos circulated with blunt assessments. Our message is inconsistent. The Soviet approach is direct, visual, and emotional. We need a platform that speaks to the future, not the marketplace. From those discussions came a new plan, one that would take America's message right into the heart of the rival camp. The idea was bold. If the Soviets could win admiration at a fair in Belgium, then America would return the gesture and show the Soviet people what democracy looked like. That opportunity arrived with the 1959 American National Exhibition in Moscow. A year after Brussels, in a massive park in the Soviet capital, the United States built its own pavilion, this time with purpose. No more last-minute assembly, no more confusion about identity. The new exhibit told a story. It showed the achievements of American science, jet engines, computers, space research. It celebrated education, art, and civic freedom. But it also included something unexpected, a model American home complete with a kitchen, washing machine, and refrigerator. On paper, it sounded simple. Another consumer display. But this time it wasn't a distraction. It was a metaphor. When Vice President Richard Nixon arrived in Moscow to open the exhibition, the scene that followed would become one of the most famous moments of the Cold War. In front of cameras, Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev began an impromptu argument inside that model kitchen, a clash that came to be known as the kitchen debate. It was polite, but charged. Nixon pointed to the appliances as proof that capitalism improved ordinary lives. Khrushchev countered that Soviet citizens would soon have the same comforts, without exploitation. To millions watching on television, it was more than a quarrel about washing machines. It was a face-off between two ideologies, staged within the very setting that had once humiliated the United States. And this time, the story played differently. The American exhibit in Moscow was widely praised. Even Soviet citizens, many of whom had never seen consumer abundance firsthand, were fascinated, not by the gadgets themselves, but by the freedom they represented. Behind the scenes, Washington officials recognized the turning point. The failure of Brussels had given birth to a new strategy. Cultural confidence rooted in human experience, not mere display. It proved that America didn't need to shout about its power. It just needed to show what ordinary life under freedom looked like. In 1 year, the U.S. had transformed humiliation into momentum. And in that transformation lay one of the Cold War's quiet victories. A victory not won with missiles or treaties, but with ideas, humility, and reinvention. From then on, Washington understood that victory in the Cold War wasn't simply about stockpiles or alliances. It was about perception, connection, and confidence. If people around the world believed that America's values created better lives, then the ideological balance would tilt in its favor. That realization gave rise to a new kind of warfare, soft power, a battle fought through culture, communication, and credibility. In the years that followed, the U.S. poured resources into telling its story more effectively. Films, exhibitions, exchanges, and cultural programs were no longer side projects. They became instruments of strategy. Artists, scientists, and musicians, from jazz performers to astronauts, became ambassadors of a democratic ideal. The same country that once stumbled through a fairground display would soon capture the world's imagination by sending men to the moon. What began as an awkward exhibition in Brussels evolved into a national awakening. That freedom sells itself best when it's seen, not explained. It wasn't propaganda in the old sense. It was persuasion through openness, the same openness that allowed self-criticism, correction, and renewal, the qualities that totalitarian regimes feared most. Looking back, the 1958 fair stands as more than a historical footnote. It was a mirror moment, a time when America glimpsed its own uncertainty and chose to fix it, not hide it. And in doing so, it turned a public embarrassment into a strategic recalibration that would echo throughout the 1960s and beyond. Even today, that lesson endures. In a world once again defined by information wars, the principle remains the same. The side that tells the truer, more human story will always hold the advantage. Because the Cold War wasn't truly won by force or fear. It was won when America learned to show what freedom looked like and trusted the world to decide for itself.